Hello and welcome to another episode of the Walled Garden podcast. So obviously 2021 is almost over. It's been a wild year in terms of, the Practical Stoic and now the Walled Garden podcast. It's been a very exciting year and many updates. And so I just want to, at the end of this year, I want to thank all of you who have come along on this journey with me throughout 2021 and the years before. Welcome to all new listeners who have just joined us this year. But it's been a real pleasure exploring these deeper philosophical topics with our guests and with all of you throughout 2021. And I have to say at the start of this episode that I did just get off a meeting with Sharon LaBelle and Kai Whiting, really just discussing the direction of the Walled Garden for 2022. And I can tell you that after that meeting, we are more excited than ever to be doing the Walled Garden podcast and building the Walled Garden community around these common values in 2022. And if you would like to find out what's happening in 2022 with the Walled Garden, make sure you go to thewalledgarden.com. You can actually sign up to our email list there, and I'm going to be dropping some emails next week, giving some very exciting updates for our vision for the new year. And you can also join the Facebook group on Facebook. Go to the Walled Garden community. You can find us there if you want updates about the direction of the Walled Garden in 2022. But nonetheless, I want to introduce you to the guest and the topic of today's conversation, because we currently live in a time where a lot of artists are getting under fire for their immoral behavior, their actions, right? And so the question comes up so often in our society today, what do we do with the art of immoral artists? Let's say a Harvey Weinstein, right? He comes out and all of a sudden everybody realizes that this man has been engaging in horrible sexual practices, right? And so then we wonder, well, gosh, can we still watch his movies? Can we separate the art from the artist, for example? And that's what the conversation is all about today, because I'm talking with Erich Matthes. He's the author of a new book called Drawing the Line: What to Do with the Work of Immoral Artists, from Museums to the Movies. And I think that we share probably differing views on this, Eric and me, but I think that today we had just a really fascinating discussion going through these questions and how can we think about this from a philosophical perspective. So I really enjoyed this conversation, really enjoy his work as well, and I'm going to put links in the show notes to where you can grab that book, Drawing the Line. And I'll tell you a little bit about Erich before we dive into the interview. So, Erich is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Faculty Director of the Frost Center for the Environment at Wellesley College. His teaching and research focus on the ethics, politics, and aesthetics of art, cultural heritage, and the environment. He majored in English and philosophy at Yale and earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of California, Berkeley. His work has appeared in Ethics, Philosophical Studies, Oxford Studies in Normative Ethics, Public Affairs Quarterly, Social Theory and Practice, Ergo, Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy, Analysis, Journal of the American Philosophical Association, Philosophy Compass, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and various edited collections. Wow. He has also written for popular outlets such as Aeon and Apollo Magazine. So, with all of that said, I'm excited for you guys to listen to this conversation, and it was an absolute pleasure to have him on the show. As I said, there will be a link in the show notes to where you can grab his book, Drawing the Line. And I just want to introduce you to Erich Matthes. Here we go. All right, so Erich, thank you so much for being here on the show. I'm really looking forward to this conversation for many reasons. And for those of you who are listening from home, Erich is the author of a new book, Drawing the Line, focusing on this question of really how do we start to think about artists who may have issues with morality, and what do we do with their art? And I'm an art lover. I consider myself an artist. I'm guessing you're the same. So Erich, I guess I wanted to just throw it out there for those of the people who are listening at home who haven't yet come across your work. who are you? How have you approached this book? And I guess the question I really want to ask as well is why now? So I'll throw all of those questions over to you and let you take over.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Simon. So I am a professor of philosophy at Wellesley College in Massachusetts in the U.S. And I've been teaching philosophy of art at Wellesley for this is my ninth year at Wellesley, so a bunch of times. And so, when I first set out, I taught philosophy of art my first year as a college professor. And when I first set out to teach this class, I included a unit on ethical criticism of art. Right? So ethical criticism of art is a common topic in the aesthetics and philosophy of art literature. It asks this question, right? Can the moral flaws or moral merits, but more focus in the literature on moral flaws, can the moral flaws of an artwork be aesthetic flaws, right? So can the fact that a movie is racist make it worse as a movie, as an artwork, right? So that's where all of that literature, that's the question that's engaged with, and people have all different kinds of answers about the relationship between the ethical and the aesthetic and how to think about them. And so, I designed this unit for the course, and I think it was like the first question that a student asked was like, well, what about the artist, right? What if, forget the artwork, like what if the artist has done or said some morally atrocious thing? How does that affect the work? So I had this question in my head for years teaching this course, and we would sort of talk about it in the class, but there really wasn't much literature that was actually addressing that question in particular. And then I think, sort of in response to events in the world, in response to the Me Too movement, in response to particular controversies surrounding artists that have sort of, bubbled along for a while, but really boiled over in recent years. Think about R. Kelly or Bill Cosby or Woody Allen, controversies surrounding really popular artists like J.K. Rowling, Michael Jackson, there's all kinds of examples. So I think that, because of everything that was happening in the news, I think I and a lot of other people were thinking more about this question in particular. So it's interesting. It's not just my book. There's been sort of a recent increase in articles and books in the philosophical space that are trying to tackle this question, right? Questions not just about the ethical criticism of art, but ethical criticism of artists, right? So when artists, do things that are morally objectionable or say things that are morally objectionable, how do we wrestle with that, right? What should we, as I sort of put it in the book, do, think, and feel? And how can philosophy help us in trying to sort through those questions? And the last thing I'll say here is that I think that was, for me, a really important motivation in writing this book, was trying to provide a resource for people who are, struggling with thinking about these issues when it comes to their own personal relationship with arts, with the arts and with artists. Because what I found, just sort of like chatting with friends and colleagues, is that a lot of people were thinking about this stuff. They were worried about it, but they didn't necessarily have good resources for thinking with. So that was my primary aim in writing this book. I mean, I do make some particular arguments and chart out some particular positions, but my primary goal is just to have a good philosophical resource that people can think with in trying to figure out what they want to do, think, and feel in response to these issues.
Yeah, and that's one thing I really liked about your approach was it doesn't seem preachy at all, and I think that it's so easy for people to fall into that trap, especially today when people are kind of picking their political religions, and so, they'll either sit one side or the other. And sometimes when you read a modern philosopher's book, it's like, their political standpoint just comes blaring through their writing as if they're trying to preach down to you. It certainly doesn't seem like that. It seems like a resource, what you've written, for thinking about these questions, opening the mind to different questions that you might start asking around this sort of thing. And so I have to tell you this as well. It's like this is such an important time for this sort of question, because I mean, I was recently watching a movie with my wife. It was a few months ago, but at the end of the movie, the credits, that's what it's called, the credits started coming on, and we saw the name Harvey Weinstein, right? And I remember seeing that, and I remember feeling, oh, like I felt like I'd been cheated out of something, because it was like, oh man. But that could have just been because it was literally the worst movie I've ever seen in my life, right? That could have been the residual effects of that. I don't think I'd ever seen a worse plot line. But even if it was something that he had done that was absolutely brilliant, I would have got that little. And this was during the moment where it was all coming out around him, and I think I still would have had that little feeling of, ooh, don't know how I feel about this. But nonetheless, I mean, as an artist, I still find myself like still pulling it apart and saying, yes, great art or bad art, but you separate. So I guess I want to dive into how you think about these questions. And perhaps the first question I'll ask then is, as soon as you start judging the moral character of an artist, I think one of the biggest problems that I have is, where do you actually draw that line? Because obviously every single individual on earth wrestles with morality. Everybody, if you peer into the innermost secrets of their life, probably has a skeleton in their closet. And even with artists, even if you don't see the immoral behavior, how are we to know? Like maybe there are so many artists who are just brilliant, but we never knew anything about how terrible they were as people. Are we, so how do you, where do you draw that line? Like, what are some of the arguments that you start to make where you think, maybe this is where we could draw a line?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Simon. And I certainly don't think that anything that I say in the book suggests that we ought to become the detectives and cops of the art world, trying to ferret out, the skeletons in people's closets and punish them for things that they've done.
Which
so
almost seems to be a public pastime today. I mean, let's see how far we can go back on somebody's Twitter, to see if we can pull something from the depths. Or anyway, I'll let you go on.
Yeah. So I'm definitely not interested in that. I don't think that's a very sort of healthy way to approach the arts, let alone sort of other people in general. And the position that I take in the book does try to take seriously the fact that people are not morally perfect. So I'm not trying to argue that we should only engage with the artwork of moral saints or something, or that we should have sort of unreasonable expectations for the lives of artists. What I really focus on in the book is the way in which common knowledge about particular, especially egregious sort of moral infractions by artists might reasonably shape the relationship we have to their work. So that's why I sort of focus on some of those very high profile cases that I talked about in the beginning, because I don't want us to think about this in terms of we need to, in order to be morally righteous art consumers, right? Find out everything there is to know about every artist, right? Because not only is that unreasonable, it also suggests this sort of bizarre, clean hands approach to thinking about the arts, where it's sort of I don't want to risk sort of tainting myself by somebody else's, possible immorality by engaging with their work, right? So that's definitely not the approach that I take in the book. And in fact, when it comes to our sort of individual engagement with the arts, or what we like to read or watch or listen to, I actually think we have a lot of moral latitude, perhaps more than some public commentators have suggested when it comes to our engagement with the arts of, or with the work of people who have done morally atrocious things. So, one claim that you see a lot in, especially more sort of popular discourse about immoral artists, and I'm just going to use immoral artists as I do in the book as just sort of a general term for artists who have acted badly in one way or the other. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily like Satan, but have done some significant morally bad thing. So, one claim that we sort of see a lot today is that when artists do something immoral, we therefore have a reason, and sometimes a very strong reason, to avoid their work, to not engage with it, just as individuals, just as sort of everyday art consumers. And while I think that there can be all kinds of reasons why you might personally choose not to engage with the work of a particular artist, I'm definitely wary of the idea that you have some sort of moral obligation, all things equal, to just sort of cut the work of these artists out of their lives, out of your life. But it's not because I don't think that their immorality matters to their work. It's that I think that there can be ethically productive ways of engaging with the work of immoral artists. So just to give two examples, right? One, when it comes to these works that we are aesthetically invested in, there can be ways in which understanding aspects of the lives of these artists offers a lens for our interpretation of the work. So we can actually, I think, have good aesthetic reason to continue to engage with these works, because not sort of despite the ethical infractions of the artist, but because there are these interesting and productive relationships between the ethical and the aesthetic. So understanding things about an artist's life can inform the way that we read their art. Some people think that that's like overreach, that you shouldn't think about the moral lives of artists when it comes to evaluating their art. But I tend to think that that claim is arbitrary, because there are so many aspects that go beyond the formal features of the work itself that we are totally comfortable incorporating into our analysis of works of art. I mean, just think about art history, right? Anybody who's taken class in art history, right, you know that in addition to doing sort of formal analysis of the work, you always talk about the time period, the political climate, the other work the artist responding to, right? That all resides outside of the work. So I think it's arbitrary to just say, well, we're not going to consider the sort of the moral aspects of an artist's life. That provides an interesting lens, right? Not the only lens, right? But an interesting lens for interpretation of what they're doing in their work. So I think there's this sort of aesthetic / ethical reason why we might have to continue engaging with these works. But then I also think that there's a sort of more straightforwardly moral reason when it comes to a broad understanding of the ethical, not just in terms of, like questions about causing harm to others, because I think when it comes to our private art consumption, we can really remove a lot of those questions from the table, right? It just seems irrelevant, right? What I watch at home, it's not causing anybody harm, right? But then if you take a broader approach to thinking about the ethical, sort of, an approach that takes seriously that ethical inquiry is about leading a flourishing life, then I think there's this other useful thing, ethically speaking, that these artworks can do, which is that they offer us a lens for sort of interrogating our own feelings and emotions in response to revelations that artists who maybe we really love have turned out to have done terrible things. So, if you are a big, fan of Woody Allen, and you sort of learn things about his life and are, put off by them, it's not obvious to me that the best way to grapple with that is to just sort of cut those works out of your life, right? Because the whole reason why the issue is of concern to you, right, more so than the concern about sort of any other moral infraction by anybody else in the world, is because you were already invested in this work. So I think that there's, a morally productive way that you can continue to engage with these works and use them as a lens for thinking about your own relationship to those works, sorting out your feelings about them, and maybe even just sort of like sitting with the difficulty of the moral problem that the particular artist brings up. So I think there are a range of morally productive things that we can do with these works. And so I'm wary of calls to just sort of like cut them out of our lives as if that were the obvious or default way to take these moral infractions seriously.
Yeah, I really enjoy that idea, and because it does seem to me, it seems so counterproductive to just say, well, that person was bad, therefore get rid of the art. Like it seems certainly like what you're saying. It's more appropriate to engage if we're already there engaging with it, if it's already part of the social dialogue, to engage with it in that kind of ethical questioning and see what this means for our lives. I mean, an example I'm thinking of currently is Charles Bukowski. Now, he was somebody who just brilliant poet, really spoke from the depths of his soul, and spoke some really important truths. Also, kind of accused of, a lot of abuse throughout his life, I believe. And you can even see that in some of his interviews, that the way that he treats the women in his life is just a little bit rough. It's a little bit, it does kind of cross the line. But nonetheless, you also learn from his writings and his interviews that he was beaten as a child, and just like terrible abuse as a child, and really had the most rough upbringing. And so, I kind of engage with his writing in while I know that he had those issues, and obviously alcoholism and all this sort of stuff. It's not that there's anything necessarily immoral about alcoholism. People need to work through that, but I engage with it in a way of, it actually helps me to have more empathy for people through his writings, because you take into account that, yeah, he was this rough character. He also had this terrible upbringing, and it's like people are so fallible. They're so liable to bringing the terrors of their past into the way they treat people in the future. And I kind of engage with his writing like that, with full respect of what he created. But your idea here, where you kind of, one thing that I read in the book that I thought was interesting was, just this idea of, does the immorality of the artist change the aesthetics for you? And I've certainly experienced that. Like I said before, with that Harvey Weinstein movie, it was like, I couldn't help that feeling of the aesthetics of the whole project being changed for me when I realized that he was a part of it. You can't help the feeling, but then it seems, don't we need to kind of say, okay, well, yeah, the feeling, I've got to wrestle with those feelings, right? And the aesthetics kind of, as soon as I know a piece of information, I can't take that away. And therefore it's going to interact with how I, feel about this piece of art. But then we can still put on the kind of, even though rationalism isn't necessarily the right way to approach art, we can still go into our heads a bit and say, well, let's separate this. Is it good art? Is it, can you separate those two worlds, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah. So here's what I think about that next question. I think that there are going to be times when the moral features of an artist's life just aren't ultimately relevant to interpretation of their work. So I don't want to take the strong view that the features of an artist's moral life are always going to bear on interpretation. What I do want to say is that we should always start from a position of being alive to that possibility, right? Just like we should be alive to the possibility that other extrinsic features of the work might be relevant to how we interpret the work. And then we need to sort of think through it, right? And engage in that process of interpretation and see the ways in which those features matter or don't. So, in the book, I talk about, for example, like, sorry to sort of go to the case everybody goes to for the most morally monstrous person, but so relevant here. But like Hitler, Hitler's obviously like, the moral monster, right, par excellence, and also happens to have been an artist. So it is a helpful sort of case. So
the lesson is really watch out for artists, everybody.
Right. Watch out for artists.
They can go down dark paths, but yeah.
Yeah. So, in a case like that, if you ever looked at any of Hitler's watercolors, it just strains credulity to think that there's anything about Hitler's moral monstrosity that is relevant to how you interpret these works. That would seem extremely forced, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we should necessarily celebrate Hitler's artwork or put on shows of Hitler's artwork. There's all kinds of other moral reasons not to do that, right? But as far as thinking about the relevance of his life to the interpretation of those works, they just seem incredibly dissociated from one another. But there are all these other sorts of examples, like some of the ones that I talked about in the beginning of our conversation, where it feels like the artist's morality bears directly on their work in ways where if you tried to pull them apart, it seems like you wouldn't really be taking the work seriously, right? So to think about issues surrounding Woody Allen, for instance, right, in a way that disassociates from the portrayal of relationships in his works. That seems like willful ignorance, right? Trying to cut out something that seems to so clearly bear on how you might think about what's going on in the work. And I think that the thing is that sometimes we think about this as almost a default position, so like on the one hand, you sometimes have people who are like, oh, like you should really keep these two things separate, the moral life of the artist and the aesthetic of the work. But then other times they seem like so obviously bound up with each other that people just sort of like assume that they clearly bear on one another. So, like the case of with R. Kelly, for instance, right? The case of Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, which for listeners who aren't familiar, is a song that R. Kelly wrote for Aaliyah in the '90s, who at the time was 15 years old and to whom he was secretly married, right? So like, I think when people know all those facts, right, then they flip the other way. They just default to assuming that the facts about the artist and his life are very relevant to how we understand and interpret the lyrics of that song. But the thing is, like, if you sort of factored out the whole R. Kelly situation, there are various ways in which you could interpret that song where it's not nearly as like creepy as it is given what you know, right? So it's interesting to see the way in which people sort of like can quickly go in one or the other direction, right? Like keep the life of the artist and the work totally separate, or, oh no, obviously these bear on one another. And so what I want to say is, yeah, sort of both of those things. We need to be alive to the possibility that aspects of the artist's life offer this sort of rich interpretive lens for thinking about their work. Whether it will or not is going to depend on the particular work and be highly contextual.
That term you just used, a rich interpretive lens. Yeah, and because that kind of implies that people can take that lens and put it, okay, now I'm looking through this lens, now I'm looking through another. And I think that's important, right? Is to show people that, you can approach an art piece from different angles, through different lenses, and you probably should in order to truly get the most out of that piece. But certainly this R. Kelly situation has affected my wife and I in a very profound way, because it just so happens that we're the kind of people who are always singing around the house. And one of the songs that always comes up for us, where, it's just a silly song, it's such a stereotypical thing, but I believe I can fly, we're just like, we'll go around the house singing that. And then all of a sudden one day everything changed. It's like, that song just pops into my head from time to time. I can't help but sing it. But every time I sing it now, I'm thinking, and you can't help, like, and I think that what I'm finding that's really interesting about your thoughts on this is, you're helping me to see that it doesn't have to be like an either or. You can recognize that, yes, the aesthetics kind of change, and yes, you're in a different world now that you know this information, but nonetheless, I can still say, great song, very catchy, clearly one of the great songs of all time. People have really, enjoyed it. And, but also, so I think that's what I'm really enjoying, is just this, it doesn't have to be a dichotomy. And I guess, I wanted to kind of, let's take a look at something like cancel culture, for example, because I know you've mentioned that in the book a few times. And how do you firstly, how do you even define cancel culture? And what do you think are some of the potential benefits? What do you think are some of the dangerous pits we might fall into in this type of time period?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the difficulties with cancel culture, like is that people use the term in all kinds of different ways, and that makes it really difficult to evaluate, right, morally or otherwise. So, in the book, when we think about cancel culture with respect to the arts specifically, I suggest that cancel culture has to do with this sort of disposition to render certain artists anathema, right? To sort of like make them, right, beyond the bounds of those that you should sort of think about, engage with, right, discuss, et cetera. It's sort of kind of like an act of erasure, right? Sort of like, if we could just sort of like eliminate that person from our art world, then that's what we should do. So it's
like a modern version of exile, isn't it? I mean,
kind of.
You're outside now, but yeah. Anyway,
right. So my take on cancel culture, at least understood that way with respect to the arts, is that I think that a lot of aspects of it are well motivated. But I think that some of the way in which it gets sort of targeted or applied can be unproductive or can sort of foreclose on certain opportunities for sort of aesthetic and moral engagement and learning. So, to quickly get back to the case we were talking about before, right, and in terms of like cutting an artist out of your life when it comes to just your own personal, right, aesthetic decisions. If cancel culture sort of provides social pressure that says, given what you know about R. Kelly, you should no longer listen to R. Kelly. Well, I think that's a mistake because I think that it is just not sufficiently open to the morally serious ways in which you can continue to engage with that work. So like that aspect of cancel culture understood in this way, I'm not particularly a fan of. I don't like the idea of sort of like a moral litmus test for which arts we engage with personally or not, for all of those reasons. That being said, when it comes to the more sort of public level or sort of the institutional level, I think there's a lot more to be said about the moral significance of what artists we choose to work with, to promote, to highlight, to honor. So I think that in the public domain, there are lots of good moral reasons to be thoughtful about how we should respond when artists do immoral things. So, I think that there can be good reasons for institutions to, cancel exhibitions, for instance, like in the book I read about the National Gallery's decision to cancel this special exhibition about Chuck Close, which I think in relation to the many accusations of sort of sexual harassment and abuse against Chuck Close, that makes perfect sense, right? But I don't think that's cancel culture in some sort of objectionable way. I think that's institutions taking reasonable and responsible steps to respond to very serious moral allegations against the people that they work with, right? Because putting on a special exhibition of somebody's work, that's an honor, and that communicates something to the public. And you don't want to communicate to the public, right, that this is a person sort of worthy of admiration, right, when simultaneously they're being accused of some pretty terrible things. So I think that there can be good motivations for those kinds of interventions. That being said, I'll say sort of one more thing about this, and then we can talk more, is that I do think that it is often the case that when an effort to cancel particular artists, where it gets sort of too focused on the artists themselves, it can actually distract from the more important work that needs to be done in this moral space, which I think is institutional reform more than sort of eliminating or erasing any particular artist. And I think that one of the things that's so frustrating about some of the discourse surrounding cancel culture is that I think for a lot of people who are concerned about artistic immorality or who are motivated to sort of take allegations against artists seriously, they really do want to engage in institutional reform. They actually don't care that much about the particular artist. It's not like they think that what the artist has done is irrelevant. It's just that they don't think that it should suck all of the air out of the room and be the only thing that we talk about. So like one of the cases that I discussed in the book that I think is just really good illustration here is there was this big article in the New York Times, like, is it time that Gauguin got canceled? Right. So Gauguin is this 19th century French painter who it seems had had sort of sexually abused sort of multiple sort of young women and Tahitian girls in the course of his career. And so this big New York Times article, right, is it time Gauguin got canceled, right? And so the thing gets framed in terms of this debate about cancel culture that's already in people's minds. And you expect you're going to see in the course of this discussion a bunch of people saying like, oh, we should like rip all of the Gauguins off the walls. We should never talk about Gauguin again. Except that's not actually what people who are interviewed in the article are even asking for. Like the most radical position that you find in the article is somebody saying like, let's not sweep it under the rug. Let's not pretend that Gauguin didn't sexually abuse Tahitian girls and then, feature them in his paintings, which are now hanging in museums all over the world, right? Let's take that seriously. And there's an opportunity there for institutions to engage with these issues, to think about the significance of the way in which, this artist or other artists have been treated, the way in which, right, we have sort of put artists on a pedestal and try to ignore aspects of their personal lives. There are ways of thinking about the relationship of Gauguin's behavior to his work. There's all kinds of productive stuff that could go on there. And I think that's really what a lot of people are looking for. And so to sort of paint that issue as one about canceling the artist is just a disservice to the nature of the discussion that's actually happening. So I think there's a lot of ways in which the sort of cancel culture framework helps to make things too much about particular artists and whether or not they should be canceled, and distracts from the important work that people are doing and trying to think about institutional reform and the ways in which our arts institutions, all of the various kinds that there are, could benefit from being differently composed, operating differently, so that we don't encounter as many of these problems with immoral artists that we currently do.
Yeah. It's really interesting, that article. Hey, because I think something that really points to is, our proclivity to sensationalize things for the purpose of getting more views or likes or reads or all this sort of stuff. And it really brings into question this cancel culture, because I've often thought, there's a few things I've thought about cancel culture. Sometimes it seems to me like it's an absolute non-issue. It's like, everybody all over the internet will be like throwing around, oh, this person's getting canceled, this person's getting canceled. And so on the right, if it's a right-left issue, sometimes on the right, they'll be like, how could they cancel this person? And then you actually go out there and you look and you think, who's canceling this person? Where is all of this noise coming from? I can't find a single web page where somebody's actually claiming we should cancel this person. So there's certainly some cultural wars being fabricated here. But also sometimes when there is a big backlash, sometimes I think these people are actually not very good at picking their battles, because the person who they've picked really, it's really questionable whether or not they were immoral in what they're doing. And not on top of that, as soon as you go out there and try to cancel somebody, everybody who disagrees with your opinion is going to go watch that thing, see that thing. And so it's like, you're basically making it way more popular than it perhaps would have been. I guess one example recently, which I've been thinking about, and just of that kind of what I perceive to be a lack of moral insight or actually paying attention to the work, is just this controversy that happens to be coming up around Dave Chappelle at the moment. Because his new special, a lot of people are making accusations that it was transphobic and all this sort of stuff. If you actually watch the special, he talks about one of his very close comedian friends who was transgender and actually committed suicide, and it was almost like a tribute to his friend, like that he was talking about her and giving her story, and and so you see that there's like 100 people or maybe like 50 to 100 people protesting outside of Netflix, and all of a sudden it's a giant international uproar. People are like interested in what's happening here. So I guess, how much of this cancel culture do you think is kind of just a little bit fabricated? Do you think that there are times where, obviously there are times when it's, really kind of necessary to take a look at these questions, but I don't know, how much of it do you think is kind of a non-issue?
So, I think that sometimes the way in which the controversies are presented in the media is fabricated, right? So where you, kind of like I was saying before, you get the suggestion that whenever somebody raises an objection to something that's happened in the art world, that the artist in question has now been canceled, right? Or is being canceled. Where even when people very explicitly say that, like, that's not their aim and that's not the game they're trying to play, that's the narrative that the media runs away with. And actually, not just the media. I mean, this is also the case where the artist who's being criticized sometimes hides behind the cancel culture specter in order to try to avoid criticism. And I mean, I think that's what Dave Chappelle is doing. So I can't comment on the content of the show because I haven't seen it. But there have been a variety of trans and non-binary folks, employees at Netflix, people right outside of Netflix who have been disturbed by the content. So I think we do need to take that really seriously. But then also, one of the employees at Netflix, a trans employee who helped to organize one of the walkouts, and who I believe has since lost their job. So let's ask sort of who is actually experiencing the fallout here. They wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where they're very explicit that their aim is not to cancel Dave Chappelle, right? Or to do anything like that, but to rather do the kinds of stuff I was talking about before, right? Engage in work to try to make changes at the organization, right? So that they're actually achieving their goals of making it sort of an equitable space where all kinds of work is produced and uplifted at the studio. So, I think that's a kind of case where you have both a media narrative and a narrative from Chappelle, where he's like, oh gosh, I'm being canceled, right? And then the people who are raising concerns are over there being like, no, we're not trying to cancel you. We just want to have a better conversation about what's at stake here when you make these kinds of jokes, right?
Yeah.
So that I think is pretty dangerous.
By the way, I do apologize. I'm having the it's almost like the light of Christ is coming in on me right now from outside. But I think you're exactly right. It's we really need to have this conversation around where is this criticism coming from? Where is it going? What do they want? Because I think there are certainly a lot of times in our culture at the moment where people are coming out and saying, okay, like, your opinion or your art offended me and we think you should be taken down. This should be taken down from the platform. I think even, Disney at the moment, I think what they're doing, their approach to this whole thing has been to put up, certain warnings at the front of movies saying, hey, listen, this was made a long time ago. And so there's going to be some stuff that might be a little bit confronting. That's not what they say, but it's essentially the gist of it. Which I think at times can be, probably useful just so that, that people have the opportunity to stop and pause and say, oh, okay, cool. Yeah. That's what we're about to watch. But nonetheless, I still always find myself just being on the side of the artist and also on the side of the fact of history, which seems to be that you don't have to look very far back to realize that everybody throughout history was involved in a certain time period with a certain spirit of that time where, they did things that we would consider to be wrong today, and we're always wrestling with that question. And so it almost seems like, we need to find a better way of interacting with history, right? Like, how do you think that comes into the picture in terms of the way we view history and the way we view art?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like we were talking about in the context of, historical paintings, I mean, Gauguin's pretty recent history, but you might sort of group that in with the sorts of work that you're talking about, where you have somebody who's living at a different, historical moment, right? Might not have been sort of sensitive to the immorality of the things that he was doing, although he probably should have been, given the nature of the case. So, I don't feel very moved by the idea that, like, oh, we should say that, at different historical periods, there were different, standards, and we shouldn't judge people based on today's standards. I don't really embrace a view of morality that is relativized in that way. I think there are various ways in which we might think about particular historical circumstances as mitigating blame, or the kind of attitude that we adopt towards a person if we really think that certain sort of moral positions were more difficult for them to access, for instance. But that doesn't bear on whether what they've done is permissible or not. And it certainly doesn't bear on the way in which those moral features are relevant to how we sort of think about and engage with their work. So, I think that we lose something both aesthetically and ethically if we take a position where we say, like, oh, we're just not going to think about or worry about the fact that there's some seriously immoral content in this work, or that this artist has done some terrible thing. I think that those facts are opportunities for us to take those issues seriously and think about the way in which they relate to the work, what we can learn from them, for instance. So, I mean, you're right that there are going to be certain contexts in which people will want to take positions where they say like, oh, well, we don't want this particular work because of its content or because of the artist to be sort of like produced or disseminated or something like that. You know, and I think what to do in those cases is going to be highly contextual. I mean, one thing to note is that the fact that people are calling for those things, right, is different from them actually being enacted, right? So it's often the case that in the context of activism and protest, people will call for things, right, like sort of like take that down, right, or like we don't want that produced, and that's just more speech. So I don't think we should be concerned about those calls, right? That's part of the nature of protest. I think in some circumstances, like in the Chuck Close case we talked about earlier, it makes perfect sense to cancel an exhibition or not to use a particular platform to promote somebody's work because of what it might express to the public. So, I think it's going to vary what we should do in those different contexts, but I think there can be good reasons to think about the things that a person has done in their life as providing some limits on how we use them as a symbol of excellence, right, or of someone to be honored. I mean, I don't talk at all really about the sort of statue, monument controversy in the book, but it relates to those issues too, right? Like, I don't think that deciding that we don't want some slaveholder to be the public symbol of a particular town or city as in any way engaging in the erasure of history, right? Or sort of not, like anything to that regard. It's like it has to do with like, what does it mean to people to have this symbol in a public space, and how might we move forward in thinking about how to craft more welcoming, right, public spaces that are not going to signal to certain groups of people like their inferiority. I mean, that just seems like so clear to me. I mean, it's hard for me to even see like how there's much of a debate about those things. But you can sort of extrapolate from those cases to some other cases in the art world as well. So it depends on what the platform is, what the context is, what we're trying to do with the work. I think that can all be relevant to how we sort of sort through those issues.
Yeah. That statue issue is very very interesting and continues to be, I guess. It's because I'm kind of with you in one sense, in that I can recognize that if I was a Black American going down there in Southern America, and you see these statues of these people who are literally fighting for slavery, I think I would have a little, again, kind of like the Harvey Weinstein thing, I'd have a little bit of a, that doesn't really sit right. Nonetheless, of course, I think that one of the interesting things about the whole, let's put people into statues is, there's also this element of let's bring the country together over common values, say like valor and courage, and you can have, like, I had this conversation with Kai Whiting, a philosopher who I'm working with at the moment, around, can somebody who's fighting for the Nazis still have courage? Yes, they can still have courage in which is a virtue, and you can still recognize even the virtues of the other side, but nonetheless there's that uncomfortable moral issue of, well, they have courage fighting for these things. But then I think one of the interesting things about that whole statue fiasco, you might say, is it quickly degenerated into something that just seemed silly, in that then they started going after statues like Abraham Lincoln. And then there were clearly people coming out on, and saying, now we start to see that this is actually almost an assault on, history in general. It's an assault on people who really fought against slavery and this sort of thing. So how do you draw the line? How do you draw the line about when it goes too far and when we start to, just degenerate into, any tiny little thing that we might think that the person has done, all of a sudden we need to take down their statue or their art? Because it seems to me like when they went as far as to say, yeah, let's take down the Abraham Lincoln statues, it was strange. Strange is the right word to me. Like, that's how I perceived it. I was like, what is happening here?
Yeah, I don't think I read about cases with Abraham Lincoln statues, so I don't feel informed about the case. But I think with respect to sort of that general right concern, I would say like resist slippery slope arguments, right? So like the fact that there's going to be a point at which somebody might be motivated to call for taking down a statue, but where there's going to be like disagreement about it, doesn't entail that every case where people want to take down a statue is therefore misguided or shouldn't be listened to, right? So I think what we're going to find in those sorts of cases is that for any particular figure that is being honored via a statue, for instance, there's going to be right some amount of disagreement about what does that statue symbolize, right? Why should we keep it? Why should we remove it? And those are going to be cases where we're going to want to look at the specific arguments that people are making, right? Yeah. So I don't think anything about this should be like sort of like knee jerk. I don't think we should say like, well, I mean that's one response somebody may have, I guess, or sort of like take down every statue, right? And then at least we won't need to worry about right the way in which statues can express right like oppressive ideas. Yeah, I guess that would be one way of solving the problem, right? But we can be more nuanced than that, right? And we can let people, right, make arguments about why they think particular, right, representations of specific individuals in particular places, right, are going to communicate something that maybe we don't want to communicate as a society. So I don't have like a general answer for, where do we draw the line in like every case surrounding honoring a particular figure. But I do think that it's important to see that the way in which we answer those questions is going to have to be specific to the cases in mind. So I think this is like a sort of circumstance where looking for sort of a one-size-fits-all solution is itself right not productive. Like we're going to have to like take into account the specificities of the particular cases.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really great about your thinking as well, is just. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, is that, talk about the specific case, talk about, each argument. And what I'm hearing from you is get involved in the social dialogue, getting involved in the cultural dialogue. I think that, it's something that I have seen today is, I kind of have a visceral reaction to the kind of cancel culture, as many people do. It just seems a little bit icky to me in some ways, just in the same way that I would feel icky about some of the things that people have done and gotten away with, who are now being found out. But also, there tends to be this trend of, cancel culture. Everybody's get freaked out about cancel culture, but then you step back and you think, hang on, no. There's a cultural dialogue going on at the moment. There's a cultural battle, you might say, and you're involved in it just by the fact that you're putting out this video saying, oh, cancel culture, how could we be doing this? You're getting involved in the dialogue, which is great. And that as long as we all agree that we're going to use our speech to engage in these questions, I think that, what might happen, hopefully, is we'll find some sort of balance as we navigate. And like we've always done as humanity, wouldn't you say, we will lift up those people who we believe to be, most representative of the true art that we're seeking, as well as the true heroism. And that will be a natural process that continues to happen. So I think, that's essentially what we're trying to get across, right? It's like, just let's get involved in this dialogue. Let's actually see if we can talk about it in a more intelligent way.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And I think that that's why I'm sort of more hesitant about the aspects of moral discourse surrounding immoral artists that says like, oh, the right thing to do is sort of like cut them out of our lives, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that there are opportunities, right, to sort of like return to those works, right? Think about them carefully. Think about the relationship between right the ethical dimensions of the artist's life and what you take out of the work. Like there's a lot of productive aesthetic and ethical work that can be done using these artworks. And so I think that's part of sort of engaging in the dialogue that you're talking about. And so I don't want to lose that, right?
Yeah.
I think that's sort of like a rich area for us to sort of think and feel together, right? Like it's the caveat right there is that like I also don't think that possibility therefore just offers some blanket justification for people in positions of authority or power in the art world to just sort of like work with whoever regardless of the kinds of things that they do, right? So like when it comes to people, like you think about like Cosby, right? Like think about how many enablers of Cosby there must have been, like, right? Like people of positions of power in the art world who like knew exactly what a predator Cosby was and just like didn't do anything about it, right?
Yeah.
No argument for like the value of Cosby's work could justify that, right? That's I think sort of like totally inexcusable. But we face different questions when it comes to like thinking about somebody who's in a position of institutional authority to help stop, right, a predator from preying on people versus like what do we do with this work now that we have it, right? I think those present very different issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and even as you're talking about that, I mean, I'm thinking about like the way that I interact with Cosby's work, and it's like I haven't watched a lot of his stuff, but it's like there's like three different dimensions. It's like, is he one of the funniest people who ever lived? I mean, yeah, he was. He was one of the funniest people who ever lived. Was he extremely immoral? Yes. And does that affect the way that I approach his comedy? Absolutely, because I can't help but have that little feeling constantly when I watch his stuff. And also, you then have the question of, well, what do we do about it now? And so these are all questions that we can engage in. And I wonder, maybe just to finish off, there was one quote that kept on popping up to me from, I think it's attributed to Aristotle by way of Seneca, but I can't guarantee that because I've also heard some things that perhaps it's a made up quote. But anyway, it was essentially that you don't get genius without a touch of madness. What do you say to something like that? What do you say to the fact that so many creative people and ultra creative people, are kind of stretched between these worlds of morality, and that, with the genius almost comes this kind of madness in their approach?
Yeah, I mean, tying in with what we were saying just a moment ago, I would be very wary of suggesting that any level of genius offers some sort of justification for like moral depravity or madness, right? Because I mean, you do see people making these claims, right, where they sort of they talk about this issue of immoral artists, and they're like, oh yeah, it's complicated, and they get to the end of their piece and they're like, but maybe artists are just like a little mad, right? A little sort of like outside of the realm of society. They don't play by the same rules that we do. And the thing I always think when I read things like that is like, well, try saying that to the victim of one of these artists, right? Try turning to somebody who's been subject to abuse by an artist and saying, well, artists, they're all just sort of like a little mad. They're all a little outside of the norms of society. That feels like it falls really short, right? Really short. So I don't think that we should think about that idea of sort of like artists as sort of on the edge of madness or whatever as offering any kind of justification for some of the sort of really, immoral behaviors that some of these artists that we've been talking about have engaged in. I think that's really dangerous. I think there's also something to be said for the way in which a society that has been permissive of that norm is going to allow for, right, the promulgation of artists who fit that mold. So this is one of the reasons why I think we really need much more reform in the art world, right? Thinking about all of those institutions that comprise the art world, right? May they be art galleries, right? Recording studios, movie studios, magazines, it's a whole mess of institutions that are wrapped up in the art world. And they, continue to be, right, largely run by, straight white men. And I think that shapes, right, the way in which, right, art gets sort of produced, what gets supported. And if you have a bunch of people who have that way of thinking about things and say like, oh, well, great art is justified by a little madness, well, then that's the output you're gonna get. So I think changing, right, the composition and operation of these art world institutions, right, through reform is plausibly going to yield a different population of artists, and we might, come to see the art world in the future as not populated by folks who are so willing to act in ways that are so outside of the moral norm.
Yeah, certainly. Look, interesting ideas. And Erich, I really want to encourage everybody to, take a look at your work. Where can they find your book? I guess you'll send me some links and everything to where people can go grab it, right? But I guess how can people engage with you?
Definitely. So, the book, Drawing the Line, What to Do with the Work of Immoral Artists from Museum to the Movies, is out from Oxford University Press on November 8th. And it is, I am told, available wherever books are sold. Always wanted to say that. But you can definitely find it on the OUP website or, bookshop.org or Amazon or any of those other sort of book purveyors. It will be there. And I'm on Twitter. My handle is ehatmatt. I don't necessarily live online, but I am there if people want to reach out.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, Erich, thank you so much for the conversation, and thank you for your work and just for opening up the dialogue a little bit more. I really appreciate that aspect of what you're doing and just encouraging people to engage with these questions rather than to be black or white. So, thank you, and I hope we have to get to have another conversation in the future.
Thanks, Simon.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. For more episodes just like these, or to join our community, go to thewalledgarden.com. See you there.